For the hands, we want to create set-driven keys that allow us to grip the fingers and extend the fingers. So to do that, we want to add custom attributes to control each of the fingers. For this example, since we're going to have the same functionality on each side, I'm going to select both of the controllers at the same time while we add our attributes. That way, we add the same attributes to each of the controllers, because eventually these are going to be our drivers. So with those two selected, I'm going to go up to Modify and down to Add Attributes. And to get started here, we're going to add our first one. This will be the index finger controller. So I'm just going to call this index, and I'm going to have a range of -10 to 10 and a default of 0. And this is going to be the same range that I use for all the fingers. So it's going to be -10, 10, and 0 for each finger. So I'll add that, and you'll see that appear in our channel box. And then we'll move on to the middle finger, -10, 10. And then we'll have the ring finger, -10, 10. Now we have our little finger, -10, 10. I'll add that. And then finally we have our thumb, -10, 10. And I'll add that. Now if you close this window, you'll see when you grab each of these controllers, they both contain these new attributes. And on top of that, if you grab both of them at the same time and you move them, I'll set these to 10 here. Now both hands should have a value of 10 in there, and that allows the animator to control the fingers of both hands at the same time. Unlike adding our attributes, we actually have to go and do the set-driven keys one by one, so we're not able to have both our controllers selected while we do this process. So I'm going to just start with this left hand here, and grab that controller, and then I'm going to go to the animation tool set by selecting this drop down and going to animation. Then I'm going to find the key tab here and go down to set driven key and click on set to open our set driven key window. Now with our hand controller here selected, I'm going to load that as my driver, and we're just going to start with the index finger, so we want to designate that in this window here. Next we'll want to load in our driven, and those are actually going to be all the individual index finger joints. So I'm going to select each of those individually, all three of them, and load those as our driven. And you'll see those appear in there. Now we can select all three of these joints, and in the next panel select the axes we're going to use to key. So in this case we're going to be rotating on the y-axis for the grip. You can test that in the window here as we rotate y. That's the normal gripping motion. And then we're also going to be using the z-axis here, because we're going to have a finger spread as the fingers come up, and we'll have them spread out to the side. Just the knuckle joint is going to move on this extra axis, but it's easier just to key them all at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and immediately key those, so we have our default position for these fingers, and then jump back over to our driver and move this index finger to +10. And at this point, I believe we should have a full grip pose. So we'll want to adjust the joints to reflect that. So I'm just going to grab each of these joints again, and rotate that finger in to where I think it looks good. So right about there seems okay. And then I'll key that. And then we'll jump right back over to the driver and just give it a test, make sure that's working. So that's working fine. Now we want to go to -10 and get this finger extent going. So we want to position these joints so that they're extending outward. So I'm just going to rotate on that y-axis, about as far as I believe the fingers should be able to go. So somewhere in there looks good. And then I'm also going to grab this knuckle joint and use that z-axis and rotate that over, so we're getting a kind of a splaying finger look. And that looks pretty good there. So I'm going to key that, and now we'll grab our controller again, our driver, and just test out that whole range. And that's looking pretty good there. He's moving between all those different keys that we set. So now we're just going to do the same thing for the rest of the fingers. I'm going to set my index back to 0. In the set driven key window, I'm going to select the middle finger, and I'm going to select those joints in the viewport, all the middle finger joints, and load those as our new driven. And I'll select those and select the Y and the Z channel again and key those immediately. Now I'll go back into the driver and I'll set the middle finger to 10. I'll grab all these joints and move these along the Y-axis, so he's gripping in there. And I'll move it kind of the same amount as I move the other fingers, so around 50 or so. And then I'll key that. And now I'll go back into the driver and just test that, make sure that's working okay. So he's moving his finger in. Now I'll go to the -10 section in the middle finger, select those joints again, and move those up with the Y as far as you'd expect that to go, that finger. Maybe even a little more, just so there's a little more breathing room for the animator, in case they want to add some extra motion in there. And that looks okay, so I'll key that. And then now we have two fingers to move around. I didn't key any Z rotation because when you spread your fingers, the middle finger doesn't really move across the Z axis. So it's okay moving just along the Y. So I'm going to set these back to 0 again. And now we're going to switch over into the ring finger. So in the set-driven key window, we want to make sure we have the ring finger selected. And then we're going to select all those joints in the viewport and load these as our new driven. Select those in the window, and then we're going to select the rotate Y and rotate Z again. And then we'll key those immediately. And just like before, we're going to go back into the controller, our driver, and set the ring finger to +10. Grab these joints and position the joints in a good gripping pose. So around 50 again, looks pretty good. So I'll key that. Then we're going to jump back into the driver, just make sure it's moving, test it out. And then we're going to do the -10 setting. So we'll start to spread and splay these fingers out on the Y-axis. And then I'm also going to rotate a little bit on the Z-axis in that knuckle joint. So I'm going to do that through the channel box just so we're getting the right values there. So that looks pretty good there. I'm going to key that and I'm going to give it a test. So I'm going to test all 3 of these fingers now just to see how they look. Looks pretty good. So these can go back to 0 and we're going to shift gears again. We're going to go to the little finger in the set-driven key window. Then we're going to select all these little finger joints and load those as our new driven. Select all those and we want to rotate Y and rotate Z on these. So I'll key those channels and jump back into our driver and grab the little finger channel and move that to 10. And the same thing, we're going to position these into gripping pose. So rotating that Y-axis somewhere around 50. The pinky looks like it needs a little extra. And key that. Now back in the driver, we're going to bring this to -10. And we're also going to just check it to make sure it looks good and make sure it worked. Sometimes when you're doing this process, you might miss a step or something, or leave one of these channels unchanged, and you'll be keying the wrong joint. So you want to just check it just to make sure. So we're back at -10 here. I'm going to select these joints again, rotate this on the Y-axis up a little bit so we can kind of splay his fingers. Then I'm going to grab this knuckle again, rotate it on the Z-axis in the channel box so we get a nice splay in the fingers as he brings it up. So it looks good right about there, and I'm going to key this. And we've got all our main fingers done, so we can just test them all out. And it looks like a few of these fingers can go up a little bit further. Like this middle finger and the ring finger aren't quite as tall as the index finger. So to fix that, all we need to do is go and change the channel in the set-driven key window here to the middle finger, and then select the middle finger joints and load those as our new driven. And we'll modify these rotation values again, just to make it look a little more correct. So I'm just going to rotate this up on the Y a little more until it matches that index finger, and I'll key that. And then I'm going to switch over to the ring finger and try to fix this as well. So I'll select that in the set-driven key window. I'll grab the joints here, and I'll load those as the new driven, and rotate those a little bit more. And some of these fingers look a little broken, and that's just because we haven't fixed our skin weights yet here. So we'll go through once we're done with this process and fix these skin weights up. You can see some of these look pretty funny here, pretty mangled. So we don't want that. We'll go through there and we'll adjust those skin weights. But anyway, that position looks a little more similar to the rest of the fingers. So I'll key that, and then I'll give that another test. We'll make sure those are looking good. So those are coming up the right amount, but when I go back in, the middle finger looks like it's sticking out a little more than it should. So I'll go back to the middle finger here in the set-driven key window, and I'll grab these joints in the middle finger and load those as a driven. Select those, select the channels, and then I'll just rotate that in a little bit just so we get a good fist. In case he wants to punch someone, he can have a nice strong fist. And I'll key that. And I also want to bring this index finger in a little bit. I think it could come in a little more just to compress this fist a little. So we'll select the index finger, select the joints, load those as our driven, and we'll move these axes until we get a good look here, a good pose for these fingers. So that looks a little better. I'm going to key that. And now when we go and move these channels, we see our changes reflected in the animation that we have. The poses I have set here for the fingers might look a little extreme in this circumstance when he's just standing here in the T-pose. But in a lot of cases, it's good to have this extra movement for the animator in case there's situations where he's dragging his finger across the surface or something. It's better than having too little. So I recommend going a little extreme with these poses. Now the last digit we have is the thumb. So I'm going to change our set-driven key window over to the thumb here, and I'm going to load all the thumb joints as our driven and select all those. And this time I'm going to select every rotate channel because this movement is going to be a little more complex. We need all those angles of rotation. As soon as I have those selected, I'm going to key that in the default position. I'm going to go back to the driver and change the thumb to +10. I'm also going to change the other fingers to a +10. That way I get the right pose whenever I position these joints for the thumb, because we don't want the thumb to wind up inside the fingers, because that's not how you make a fist. We want it to be kind of underneath this joint right here. So I'll grab all the thumb joints, and to start I'm just going to rotate along the y-axis, just get that kind of into where I want it to be. And then next I'm going to grab this first joint here and rotate it until that thumb is resting on top of these other knuckles of the other fingers, so kind of around here. I'm going to use all the different axes of rotation here to get that to look right. I'm not really going to discriminate here because it's kind of a funny little area. But once I get that looking okay, I'll key that, and then we'll go back into the driver, and then I'll move all the fingers up into their maximum splayed out position. So I want the thumb to kind of follow suit with this and look correct during this pose. So I'll grab the joints again, and I'll rotate them up along the y-axis here, and then I'm going to grab these last two joints here and rotate them by themselves, just so we get that splaying look. And we're not getting the right distortion here because of the skin weights, so we may just have to come back later and reposition these joints just so they look good. But it doesn't look too bad for now. I'm going to grab this and just make a few extra adjustments here so that it's looking kind of the way I want it to look there. And once I'm happy with that, I can just go ahead and key all those joints positions. Now I'll take the driver and just grab all these attributes here and just give them a little move just to make sure we got the right movement there. And so that's looking pretty good to me. I think we can move on and do the same thing on the other hand, and we'll just go through that hand a little more quickly now that we have the process down.